Good afternoon. All right. Well, if I said the words Monty Python, what would be the first thing that comes to your mind? And now for something completely different. Well, now for something completely different. So my name is Colin Polsky. I'm at Florida Atlantic University. That's FAU. Our friends at FIU, we often get confused for them, but I'm delighted to be here. And as the title suggests there, how are we going to pay for it? But what is it? It is the adaptation. That's in the A in the CAC name. So I'm not going to talk about the biodiversity per se, but Alistair's talk, one of the last slides, if you recall, had various indirect or first or second order benefits of coral reefs to tourism, to medicine, to coastal flood power reduction, right? So that's kind of what I'm going to talk about, is link to the intrinsic connection between our ocean and our coastal zones and our economies, and then climate change is always looming. So do I advance the slides, sir, or do you? Okay, great. So in the vehicle I'm going to do that with, and here's the end now for something completely different, is a new state office. And so you all as residents of Florida, this is your office. There's a new Florida Office of Ocean Economy. And you might be asking yourself, well, what is an ocean economy? And I was actually going to take a poll and see what you said, because it's a relatively new concept. You know, it kind of means what you might think it means based on the name. But once you start trying to wrap your head around it and tackle it and put it into practice, it becomes quite varied and super interesting. And so when I stumbled into this role, I hadn't really heard the term. I mean, I'd heard of blue economy and ocean economy less, but blue economy, you know, there's a lot of economic value I kind of vaguely thought about from time to time associated with the ocean. But if you set down to try and measure it, track it, and figure out the leverage points for improving our economic and social welfare, while, of course, preserving the ocean environment that provides the economic opportunities in the first place, we can think of a stronger future for our young workers and our children as they grow older and look for opportunities in the workforce. And of course, climate change is happening. And so that, as we've heard very eloquently here today, presents some serious stresses on our ocean ecosystems and in our coastal zones. So let me introduce you to what we are charged with doing on your behalf. So this office, it's a state office. It's housed at Florida Atlantic University, but again, it is a state office. So it was signed into law by the legislature and the governor in May of 2024. So we're about a year and a half old, and we're essentially the statute that created us is quite brief and vague. So we're basically supposed to help. And you know, that's like, that makes things a little easier. It also makes things a little dicier because, you know, we have to submit reports to the state legislature. But we're supposed to help. We're supposed to promote this ocean economy in all of its different facets, not just in the university setting, but working with nonprofits and working with government at multiple levels and working with the private sector. And so that'll be one of my primary foci here today, is linking with the private sector and entrepreneurship and startups in a more muscular and explicit way than perhaps we have in the past. So in the office, what we were on the hook in the first year with no funding, incidentally, to write an annual report. And in this annual report, which is on our website, it's fau.edu FAU/ocean-economy. So FAU/EDU ocean economy. So we have 5 activity areas or focus areas, and you see them here. And so if my statement a minute ago that this is not a research first and only enterprise, it's not just a university exercise initiative, it is many things. We cover the waterfront, so to speak, of the different activities that one could envision as being helpful for the cultivation of any economy. Reading top to bottom, there's business and entrepreneurship, there's research, innovation, and impact, education and workforce development. Normally, I don't read things that are up there, but I know that some of the print might be a little small for those of you in the back. Policies. You know, I'm a big fan of the private sector and the market to solve these challenges in a way that government and nonprofits can't do on their own. But the policy environment, we've heard about mangroves here today, for instance, as a very beneficial species. If we could just help them be healthier where they are or help them migrate to where they may wish to go. But there are policies around mangroves. If any of you has mangroves on your property and you wanted to trim them, you might not want to actually, because it's against the law. So there are some things that exist in our regulatory environment, for example, that just need to be taken into account as we are facing this new moment of a booming Florida in the context of climate change and the challenges that we've already heard today. And then finally on that list is investment and access to capital. So this is one of the things. So this is my 30th year in the climate change business, so to speak. I just realized that earlier today. And the main thing that's been missing from the conversation on the solution side of things, I'm an academic, I'm a climate social scientist, so I'm not really on the hook for creating solutions, but in that conversation over the last 30 years, the private sector has been really absent from the academic and the policy discourse. And within that conversation that has existed on the private sector, the kind of investment and access to capital, and I mean big capital, has been even less present. So we're trying to elevate that really important key, right? You know, how are you going to drive the car if you don't have the key? Key here is the capital to fund some of the things that you've seen here by my colleagues who presented already today in terms of their research and implementation. Especially, not only do we have climate change, but now we have a federal government which has given us a very clear signal that they're going to reduce federal funding for research in general across the board, not entirely across the board, but certainly when it comes to environmental questions. So how are we going to pay for it? The federal government, our country's government, say what you will, has been the world's leading shining example for, this is my opinion, I can't prove it, but for research. Basic science, applied science, worldwide, and we're really appear to be pulling back. So how are we going to pay for the types of responses that you all are probably thinking about, having listened to the presentations so far? So let me briefly introduce you to this ocean economy concept with some a little more detail and a few numbers. So again, you might be wondering, what is an ocean economy? So we followed the literature and adopted a 6-sector taxonomy. And you can hopefully read those on the left, 1 through 6. I'll briefly reference them in case it's too small. Tourism, transportation, construction, energy, military, and minerals is its own category. I'm still wrapping my head around why that collection of things, but it has some logic. Manufacturing and shipbuilding, living marine resources, which is typically thought of as a fisheries and aquaculture category. I want to add to that some of what we've heard about here in terms of the coral health, for instance, other measures of ecosystem health in the oceans and in the coastal zones. Those are resources, but fisheries and aquaculture, you can pretty readily, relatively speaking, measure their economic value. And then finally, research and education. So that's where my sector of higher education, as well as K-12 comes in. So those are your 6 sectors. And if you see the graphic on the right, you probably can't read. I'll just tell you the number 1 sector by a long shot, is 37%. That's tourism. Number 2 is 33%, so not too far in second place, transportation. And then about a quarter of our state's current ocean economy in terms of GSP, that's GDP, but for a state, is construction, energy, military, and minerals. So a good 70 or more % of our economy is just these 3 sectors. That leaves very small slices of the pie for the other 3 sectors, which is something really to take home as you're thinking about this ocean economy and what are the different pieces of it in terms of their economic importance. It doesn't mean that those last 3 with the very small slices are not worth looking at. It just means that relative to the big dogs like tourism and transportation, they are much smaller. It also might stimulate a question in your mind, so this is one way to differentiate the sectors. Another might be to think in terms of multipliers, or what are the indirect effects economically in terms of employment and output, sales of goods and services, of a dollar investment in any one of these sectors, in any one of these 6, what is the multiplier of that, the ROI, if you will? And our preliminary evidence that we've been looking at suggests that the smaller slices up there have the higher multipliers. So that's the source or the focus of some ongoing work in our office to refine that a bit. Incidentally, one of the things, this may be a footnote, maybe it's a top point, but we've all heard about the federal government pulling back on funding of research. I want to say also, recall for all of us, they also are the world's leading investor in the observational space. So NOAA, for instance, we've seen some slides today already from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Where's Bob? There's Bob. So we have a link. I was a UCAR postdoctoral fellow, and that's part of NOAA. So thank Bob. NOAA, it's awesome. But NOAA is on the chopping block. And that is and they do research. They also fund research, but they also have a vast observational network of ocean measurements, atmospheric measurements, measurements over the land. And so we are in a moment where we have to ask, how are we going to pay for it? So as challenging as the situation has been in this country to animate climate action, it's more behind, if you will, further behind in other countries, at least in terms of the funding available to date, our future funding available for not just research, but again, also these observational networks moving forward is really in jeopardy. So can we find funding to continue the work that all of us are interested in outside of the federal government? This is a slide that I won't spend much time on. It's basically a tabular version of the slide I just showed in terms of which sector is the most robust, or what's the rank order of GSP, but it also shows employment. And so I just want to take a quick moment to highlight, we're talking about on a direct employment side. Does this laser, does it work? Allison, it works. Where is it? Where's the? Oh, but that's so small, no one can see the dot. All right, so direct employment is this first column of numbers on the left. In the yellow there, it's 500,000 jobs. Is that a lot? Well, our calculation is it's about 4%, thank you, sir, of the state's total employment. But indirect, if you take the indirect employment, it jumps up to 6%. Is that massive? Is it 80%? No, but this is a big deal. It's also an economy where these sectors have room to grow. Now, again, we're here from an environmental perspective, the coral are dying and so on and so forth. And so we can't grow this economy without protecting these resources. And as we've heard already, there's only so much that we can do locally to global temperature trends, although we can do our part. But we can also talk about how we might take action. And so I'm delighted to hear about what you call it, living laboratory for adaptation here. Where I am in Southeast Florida, I'm very proud, even though I had no hand in creating it, of the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Change Compact, which is a true national leader in bringing groups of people together across jurisdictional boundaries to adapt, essentially. And so this, I look forward to tracking what you guys do there. Okay, so the economy, that's how we classify it. The data for that as well are going to become more difficult for us to gather and then analyze, because the data are typically from federal sources. And so who knows? But we're here for the hard work. So a little bit about the workforce. So we also, and one of the other reasons for urgency for this office is that our economy, our ocean economy, again, is large nationally, and then rankings to other states. And that's another thing on the table I didn't highlight, but we are in the top tier of top 10 for sure, top 5 in some cases of ocean economies nationwide. And we want to grow. We appear to be facing a pretty important workforce shortage. As it says here, over 100,000 jobs are not apparently going to be filled unless we adapt and we figure out a way to animate the workforce, starting with the high schools and getting some of these concepts out to our younger people, and working then with the CTEs, the technical colleges, the community colleges, and the universities, and industry to specify what skills these jobs need. And then we can work backwards at the educational institutes to make sure we're training for those skills. Okay, also the workforce, real wages appear to have declined, and now we've all experienced the post-COVID inflation in this country. And so this is just a note to say that even though nominal wages have increased after inflation, there's people in this part of our economy are taking home less money. But that need not be the case. A couple of very quick case studies. One of the things we're doing in the category of awareness raising around the ocean economy, and then for highlighting ways we might intervene as private citizens, as nonprofits, as businesses, or governments or academic institutions, is to compile a library of case studies about all the great talent that is in this state in the ocean economy space. So here's one example. Apparently, speaking about workforce, several years ago, I met the CEO of the Marine Industries Association of South Florida. And he said, you know what? The CEO, I have a lot of member organizations who are dying to hire marine HVAC technicians. And we'll pay them 6 figures, and you only need this apprenticeship certification, for which you only need a high school diploma or equivalency to begin, and we can't hire. And so there's just not, the people are not coming and responding to the ads. So they started as a manifestation of adaptation. They started a certification program at one of the technical colleges to accommodate this lack of jobs and skilled workers in this area where people can make a good salary. And then part of their job is to promote it. You know, there are a lot of kids in high schools where I live in Palm Beach and Broward County and Miami-Dade, where they're not far from the beach and the ocean, but they're not spending a lot of time there. So there's an awareness raising. And this, to me, is an example of the type of thing it would be nice to, one way or another, promote the expansion of across the state. Another one on the more entrepreneurship and startup side of things, and some of you may know Ocean Exchange or Tampa Bay Wave or the St. Pete Innovation District, perhaps. Anyway, there is this growing, has anybody seen the TV show Shark Tank? All right, that's this, I haven't really seen it, but there are pitch competitions everywhere now in many sectors, and the ocean space, blue economy it's often called, ask me later over drinks why we're calling it the ocean economy. There are pitch competitions around clever ideas for, and our coral friends may know some people who are involved in some of these business ideas one way or another, on how to, for example, promote the regeneration of coral under various stresses, and how to get those ideas into the market. And so one of my things over now 3 decades of working with, not just in research, but with students, is, you know, I would say, why are you interested in environment, and what do you think you'll do after you graduate? And 100% of them say, well, I'll either work for the government, like the Fish and Wildlife Commission or something, which we have friends from, which is great, or a nonprofit, which is great, but or academia, far fewer, thankfully, but that's great too. But the private sector is just absent from their vocabulary, and there's no good reason for that. There's no acceptable reason for that. And so luckily, we don't have to, in the Florida Office of Ocean Economy, we don't have to create all of these things. These are pre-existing groups and activities in Florida and around the country and around the world. There was a UN conference on the blue economy in Nice last summer, for instance. There was just one in Barcelona like 2 weeks ago. This is a big global booming business. So anyway, these are groups that find funding, incentives, prize money for young people to hatch their great idea about helping our ocean and coastal zones while also making a profit and employing people. And it's quite inspirational. So what are we going to do about it, and what can you do to help us? I want to use this matrix, which, again, might be small. I will walk you through it very briefly, but I call it OOE, stands for Office of Ocean Economy. So I'm calling this the OOE Action Square. This is where the adaptation action takes place from a conceptual framing perspective. And so all this are along the rows are the focus areas. Remember the first slide I showed? One of the first, there are 5 focus areas: business, finance, research, so on. Then the columns are the 6 sectors. I showed that subsequent to the list of the 5 activities. So tourism, transportation, military, and so on. So the question is, where do you see yourselves in terms of what you may be able to bring to this conversation? At what intersection do you see a possible way to contribute and share your experience with us, where it's not us, it's us as an amplifier through the various communication moments and engagement and such that we're doing. So what I have here are some yellow stripes in a few of these boxes. As an illustration, there's a donor that we're were fortunate enough to come across at Florida Atlantic, who said to our environment school, ECOS, we'd like to sponsor this conference, which is coming up next month, which is that Compact, the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Change Compact Group I talked about. They have an annual meeting. The point here is this annual meeting is a top-notch destination for policymakers, local government, staff, and some folks from higher ed, nonprofits, elected officials as well. But they are often not embracing, there aren't a lot of students who come. But through this sponsorship, we now can bring students to this conference as a form of professional development and networking and open their eyes to what this world of ocean economy, climate change, and they intersect looks like. It's not like the classroom, right? So the classroom's great. I'm a professor, I know, I love it, but there's a life outside, and so the more we can introduce our youth. So that's just one example of how somebody has stepped up and said, this is a way, something we can do to try and bridge the higher ed youth, younger folks, with the professionals in the climate change adaptation space. So I return to this matrix here, empty of stripes, but again, just to ask you, where do you think you could contribute to elevating our state's ocean economy? At what intersection here? And so there are 5 focus areas and 6 sectors. There's 30 squares in this matrix. In this year, which ends June 30 of 26, we are committed to fleshing out a manageable number of these squares. Storytelling, because we are at the early stages of this process of articulating what Florida's ocean economy looks like, and therefore, and subsequently, how we can intervene to try and improve our economic and social welfare. So I'm going to leave you with that. And another activity we're doing to have those conversations in more detail than we're having at this moment is listening sessions across the state. So for this purpose, we've divided the state into these 5 regions. And we're just getting started. I was able to hire a great temporary staff of consultants. And so our first listening session is virtual. These will all be virtual because of time and money, although we do hope to have 1 or 2 in person, because in person is better. But the first one is December 2nd, so coming up in a couple of weeks. And so the point of the listening session is within 45 minutes or so, have a conversation, curated conversation as a group, and then breakout groups and a little more in depth in the breakout groups on Zoom about that question, that intersection between an office focal area and an ocean economy sector. Where do we see opportunities? Also, where do we see challenges? That's one of the things that we in the office need to communicate to the legislature and the governor, is in the category of how do we promote the ocean economy? Yeah, here's an opportunity, but here's a challenge in another area as well. If that's an obstacle, I'd like to remove. So it's part of the democratic process, if you will. Science meets policy and action. So we have a QR code. That's one of the things I can proudly say we have. And if you want to join our mailing list for free, we will take a picture of the QR code, please, and you'll be part of the growing family. There's our website again, FAU.edu/ocean-economy. Thank you.
Questions?
I have one over here. It's me again. Okay. So I actually noticed something very interesting. If you go back to the slide where you had all the numbers, all of the jobs and all the different areas had about the same ratio except for one. So if you look at the labor income to gross state product, it's usually about $1 of labor income to about $1.5, $2 worth of gross state product. But if you look at only marine living resources, you see that it's for every $1 of labor income, it's $4 of state product. It looks like there's an undervaluation of working with marine living resources, that if that were to be fixed, you would get a lot more people in that industry specifically. And as someone who does work in the marine living resources industry, it's a big problem with a lot of monoculture farms and even prison labor deflating that value. So anything that you can do to help bring up the labor income for those workers in that industry would help with recruitment, because that is the main limiting factor in that industry.
Well, that's interesting, and I'd love to talk with you more about that. One of the related things that I've learned in this role, I get a lot of phone calls unsolicited from people who are often startups, entrepreneurs, and they've got really clever ideas. And this one person said, just let me talk with you for 5 minutes. And when anybody says they talk with you for 5 minutes, it's really an hour and a half. But let me just talk with you for 5 minutes. Oysters are going to save the world, and I know how to do it. Okay, well, but in that context, in the course of the conversation, he said, Honduras, for example, has a really large aquaculture industry, in other countries in the Caribbean. For example, they're larger than ours in this country, not Florida's, in this country. So yes, the marine living resources, aquaculture, and fisheries is the two groups of activities that those numbers are tracking, does appear to have tremendous room for growth, especially as the planet's population keeps growing and getting wealthier and people start demanding more protein. So it's a brave new world.
All right, Colin, last question over here. Hi, Liv.
Fantastic talk. Thank you so much. I similarly have some questions about some of these numbers that you were showing, and I couldn't help but notice in the previous figure in particular, right, with the marine and coastal tourism being by far the biggest sector money-wise, I would argue that what underpins that is the living marine resources. People come here and spend their tourism dollars to fish, to dive, to be on our coral reefs. And so I'm wondering if, maybe just a rethinking of how those values are attributed to the different categories might almost help show that actually a lot of that revenue is still really, really related to our marine resources and those being intact and healthy.
Well, I 100%, it is the ocean economy health is directly linked to our ocean ecosystem health in our coastal zone. So yes, at some point you do have to decompose the problem and for data tracking purposes, but the good news here is, I appreciate that. We will, and if we don't, hold us accountable. Absolutely, we're committed to making sure that notion of interconnectedness is evident throughout the reporting and activities. It's also true that what makes me breathe a little easier on this is the legislators that I've talked with really get it on both sides of the aisle. So it is not a controversial thing. They know that this is the golden goose, so let's protect it so we can increase on the other areas.
I think that's a really good point. And, we have the green economy and the blue economy. But what we talk about at the CAC is the integration of all of that into the climate economy.
Yeah.
Because the climate is what's driving all of this. And, well, I think it's really cool to talk about the different parts of that climate economy. I think what we really need to do is elevate the conversation to really what's the driver, because we're sort of getting almost to the right point, but we're not quite crystallizing it. But what you are doing, and your role as a scientist and a social scientist, talking about entrepreneurs and talking about stimulating the answers that we're going to need with the younger generation, is all about how we get out of this situation. The longer we stay in these small, defined fiefdoms, the longer the real solution is going to take to emerge. So I really applaud you, Colin, and one of the reasons I really wanted you here is because he's a bridge person. He's a bridge person to the future, and we need a lot of Collins out there. So thank you so much, Colin, and it's time for cookies.
Yeah.